So before I start diving into specific monitoring projects and results, I wanted to remind everyone of the ECOP Project Effectiveness Monitoring Plan. We released this in April of 2024. The topics covered include why monitoring, the development of the ECOP Disturbance Monitoring Protocol, methodology and data analysis, and how we manage the data. This is posted on our website for everyone to download and review. If you go to our resource library, it is within there. The bulk of the monitoring plan focuses on our approach, where we describe the limiting factors our restoration approaches must address to make progress toward desired ecological outcomes. The 4 ecological outcomes are that oaks are released from conifer encroachment, mature oak habitat features are retained and recruited, species composition and stand structure indicate resilience to disturbance, and diverse native oak-associated species and pollinators persist. The plan also goes into detail on specific monitoring questions, objectives, metrics, sampling frequency, and sample design that will inform on treatment effectiveness. So for the majority of our restoration projects, we incorporate monitoring efforts to help partners determine if their management actions are having the desired effect. So this is known as monitoring treatment effectiveness. Monitoring is also an important step in adaptive management, where land managers can pause to see how their treatment went and adjust their future approaches if necessary. Now we have over 200 monitoring plots installed across Oregon and Washington. So we are building a long-term data set of oak systems that can help people assess landscape scale trends. Again, if anyone has a grad student, we have a lot of data. So today I'll be covering 2 monitoring projects specific to the Mount Hood National Forest. I did give this presentation several weeks ago at the Wasco County Forest Collaborative meeting, so you may have already heard it. But I'll be talking about Grasshopper and Rocky, which are 2 projects shown in orange and red, circled on that map. And those other polygons are just other places where we have monitoring going on. And then Dr. Lucy Kerhoulas will join the presentation at the end to share some preliminary observations from our Oaks on the Trailing Edge monitoring project, where we're using physiology measurements to give us a more immediate idea of oak response to thinning treatments. So for those of you that haven't heard of the Joint Chiefs, it's a landscape restoration partnership program, and it's a collaborative effort between NRCS and the U.S. Forest Service to work across public-private boundaries and at a landscape scale. So several years ago, the Mount Hood National Forest was one of the partners that was awarded over $3 million to conduct a wide range of restoration treatments. The goal was that the treatments will create resiliency to large-scale disturbances while mitigating wildfire threats to communities within the wildland to urban interface. Monitoring was included with this award with the purpose of informing future restoration prescriptions and strategic direction to the Forest Service. Like I said, we've published our monitoring plan the last couple of years, and we have developed a wide range of monitoring questions for our partnership. For the projects I'm talking about today, these are the 2 most relevant questions we hope to answer. First, did the treatments effectively reduce conifer density and improve Oregon white oak vigor, which would include things like more dominant crown positions and oak seedling recruitment? And number 2, did fuel reduction treatments in oak systems effectively reduce fuel loads and ladder fuels while retaining large oaks and limiting ground disturbance? To answer those monitoring questions and see if project objectives were being met, we implemented the ECOP Disturbance Monitoring Protocol at each project area. This is a standardized protocol that ECOP has developed over the last several years. It's heavily modeled after the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory Analysis methodology, if you're familiar with that. Our protocol assesses comprehensive ground, surface, herbaceous, shrub, and tree data to measure East Cascade oak system response to disturbance events such as wildfire, prescribed fire, and thinning. On the left, there is a diagram of kind of what the plot looks like. Each plot is marked in the center. It's a 50-foot radius circle. That's approximately 0.2 of an acre. And there's smaller inner circles where various measurements take place for trees and the understory. Measurements include plot characteristics like basic slope elevation, the management history, tree and snag measurements such as DBH, height, crown position, and various tree health indicators on trees of different size classes, as well as a number of seedlings and saplings, oak stump sprouts, percent ground cover, and fuel transects that measure fine woody debris, coarse woody debris, and fuel bed depth. So it's a pretty comprehensive plot. I'm going to start by discussing the grasshopper project. The treatment here was a small thinning of conifers, mechanical mastication, and mechanical piling. ECOP provided monitoring support by hiring a contractor to install 15 monitoring plots across the area that were sampled in 2024, which would be the pretreatment data collection, and then in 2025, which was a few months after treatment was completed. This is a map from the Forest Service just showing the full grasshopper environmental assessment, which is south of the Badger Creek Wilderness. And then we installed 15 monitoring plots more on the eastern section of grasshopper where the oaks were more common. The elevation of the plots averaged about 2,600 feet and slope averaged 6.5%. There were different oak system types. 6 were classified as forest with oak, so that's where oak is kind of a minor component. 6 mixed oak and conifer, and then 3 open oak woodlands. So first off, I'm sharing results from the ground cover guilds, which we estimated in percent cover classes within an inner 11.8 foot radius circle. And we're interested in how plant groups were impacted by treatment and if treatment increased bare ground. For most of the variables I'm sharing today, for all you statistic nerds, I used a paired t-test to compare the differences between mean cover values from the pre-treatment to post-treatment. And we found that an increase in bare ground, which increased by an average of about 13%. We also saw a decrease in native forbs, graminoids, shrubs, and lichens. These measurements were taken just several months after treatment was completed. So I think it remains a little too early to tell if these reductions in plant groups like forbs and graminoids persist into the future. It kind of makes sense if you have machinery in there that those plants are going to get knocked down and there'll be some bare ground. We were a little surprised to find no difference in the coarse woody debris or the fine woody debris following mastication. So those are fine woody debris is like sticks on the ground, and coarse woody debris are 3 inches or larger. So mastication sometimes, creates more woody debris on the ground. But I think it may be due to the patchiness of the shrub mastication or the balance of removing woody debris and piling it, but also new woody debris is created when machinery moves through the area. So now this figure is showing the number of trees per plot, separated by tree species on the x-axis. There's 3 tree species. And then separated by year. So again, 2024 is pre-treatment and 2025 is post-treatment. I'll be showing several box plots during the presentation, so I'm just going to explain kind of how to interpret this. They're known as box and whiskers plots, and they show the median of the data, is that solid black line, which is the middle value of the data. The box represents the interquartile range of the data, which is the middle 50% of data points. The whiskers are the solid lines, which end at the minimum and maximum values of the data, excluding outliers, which will be shown as single dots on future graphs. And I like showing these they show kind of the spread of the data and give a little bit more information than a typical bar graph would. So for tree density, again, I did a separate t-test for each tree species to compare differences between the density before and after treatment. We found no significant difference in tree density for ponderosa pine or Douglas fir, but some of this may be explained by the DBH ranges. So DBH is diameter at breast height. The ponderosa pine trees ranged from 6 to 30 inches in DBH. And it appears that pine trees with less than 7-inch DBH were cut, but those with a larger DBH were left standing. Douglas fir trees ranged in DBH from 4 to 32 inches, with only 2 trees being under the prescription of cutting 12-inch DBH and under. So at least for Douglas fir, most of the trees were outside the range of the prescription, were just too big to be cut. So that's why we see no decrease in conifer density. We did see a moderately significant decrease in number of Oregon white oak after the thinning treatment. They averaged about 3.1 trees per plot before the treatment, and then 2.3 trees per plot after treatment. I looked at the data to see what type of oak trees were being removed. Most of them were 5 to 7-inch DBH, so smaller oak trees. There were 2 larger oak trees that were 13 and 15 inches of DBH that we saw before the treatment, but not after the treatment. Those were noted as having some abnormal growth forms like broken tops or bent, kind of like a bent over bowl. So I think that might be why they were removed. We also looked at snag density, but found no differences after treatment. We found a significant increase in number of seedlings after treatment. Oregon white oak had the greatest number of average seedlings per plot. So those that we measured within kind of a small 6.8 foot radius plot, because sometimes there can be a lot and you don't want to spend a lot of time counting them. There were 2.5 average seedlings for Oregon white oak before the treatment, and then 7 seedlings after the treatment. Ponderosa pine and Douglas fir also increased after treatment, but they just averaged less than 1 per plot, so they were a more minor component. And this figure on the right kind of shows that, shows the percent of seedlings by species. So you can see the majority were Oregon white oak with that brown color. It's also interesting to note the small increase in ponderosa pine seedlings, which may have disturbance, the increase in light, or just perhaps 2025 was a better seed production year than 2024. We also look at saplings, which are defined as a tree tall enough to reach breast height, but it has a small DBH of less than 2.5 inches. And there were only 3 plots with ponderosa pine saplings in them. 3 out of the 4 saplings found before the treatment were not observed the following year, so likely removed with the mechanical mastication treatment. This isn't a measurement we would expect to increase right away, and they're kind of targeting those smaller trees anyways. But just interesting to note, this increase in seedlings might turn into saplings in 5 to 10 years. There was a significant increase in oak stump sprouts from 2024 to 2025. The number of oak stump sprouts averaged 0.3 in 2024 and then 2.4 in 2025. And we measured those within the 24-foot radius plot. And that's what an oak stump sprout is. You can see that oak tree was cut, and actually pretty quickly they end up resprouting, depending on where you are. I did want to point out that while oak stump sprouting can be seen as oak vigor response, it's also changing the structure of oak from one single larger stemmed individual to multiple smaller stems. So if your management goal is to increase foliage, say for deer browse, cutting oaks can be desirable. But if the goal is to reduce stem density of oak, cutting oaks will not achieve that goal without treating the resprout with herbicide or potentially repeated fire.
Stacy, quick question. Did you happen to age any of those smaller?
No, I didn't. Mm-hmm. We're also interested in if the treatment improved oak vigor in terms of crown position. So this is an image from the Forest Service FIA methods that shows the various crown positions in a forest, ranging from open grown, which is number 1, that kind of more like oak savanna tree, to overtop trees, which are that code number 5 in the diagram. So the oak tree on the photo in the right is facing competition from surrounding pine trees. It's dropped limbs on its lower half And I could probably consider that to be classified as co-dominant, just for an example. So while there are fewer oak trees present post-treatment, the change in crown position we see here suggests the oak trees remaining after treatment had more light. So 6 trees were classified as dominant in 2024 and none as open grown. And then in 2025, which is post-treatment, 11 trees were classified as dominant and 1 as open grown. With all of our monitoring plots, we take photo points along each transect to track visual changes. Before and after photos help tell the story really well. So in this photo, you can see kind of not within our 50-foot plot, but beyond that, there was a lot of shrub and small pine saplings that were removed with the treatment. Kind of another example showing how on the left it was fairly dense before and a lot more open after treatment. This is an area where there was a particularly heavy ground disturbance, I would say. And I also just wanted to point out, we noticed an oak snag that seemed to be removed with the treatment, kind of in the center there, that appears to be an oak snag. It's not there after treatment. Just showing some more mastication of the shrubs in the area. And then you can see here the pine sapling that was removed, and then you can also see the pile. It's kind of hiding behind the trees, but that's where they piled the material. We did notice some machinery ruts. The location of these ruts near the root crown of that ponderosa pine on the right could potentially damage the mature pines, so it'd be something to keep an eye on. So for a summary for grasshopper, an increase in bare ground, a decrease in native forests, native graminoids, non-native graminoids, shrubs, and lichens. But again, this was only a few months after treatment, so we really need another year or two of data collection. We saw a small decrease in number of Oregon white oak trees. Number of Oregon white oak seedlings more than doubled after treatment. And Oregon white oak stump sprouts increased. And we saw a shift in Oregon white oak trees to more open grown and dominant crown positions. One result I didn't highlight yet is that we did see a significant difference in the height of the lowest dead oak limb. So the lowest dead limb height averaged about 8 feet before treatment and then 11 feet after treatment. And that makes sense that machinery is moving around the unit and would be knocking off some of those lower branches. So it's kind of like limbing happened. We also look at a whole lot of other variables, but these were not significant. Just so you know, we had no significance of snag density, snag DBH, crown base height, number of fine woody debris, number of coarse woody debris, average diameter of coarse woody debris, log decay class, fuel bed depth, oak DBH, and height of lowest live oak limb. So I was going to stop here. This is kind of the end of grasshopper before I move on to the next site, to see if anybody has any questions or reflections about what I just shared.
Stacy, what are your plans for the future for these monitoring plots?
I was going to mention that at the end. We do have in our funding to resample these plots, I think in 2028. So kind of like 3 years after treatment. So I think that'll be really helpful. And we, have that with our OEB funding.
Who wrote the prescription agency, or is that you?
The Forest Service did.
The Forest Service did.
Yeah.
And what was the reasoning behind not cutting large dead bird? Do you know?
I'm guessing, I don't know. Usually that 7-8 inch diameter cap has to do with permitting and what you can get away with under a categorical exclusion, what you have to do in ECOP for. So. Claire, do you know? Do you happen to know?
I haven't seen that prescription, but I can ask, but I think you're on track. That's usually sometimes social license.
I don't know how to raise my hand. This is Whitney. I finally made it.
Hey, Whitney.
Hi, Whitney.
Hi.
Whitney's
So
here.
grasshopper, NEPA does allow for larger tree diameter, but because of ongoing litigation, we chose to do the small diameter non-commercial work first while we were working through litigation. So some of the grasshopper units, this treatment was just the first entry and will likely see additional entries where needed to meet desired conditions. I can't speak to all the oak units in grasshopper because some of them will just be burned. But grasshopper in particular, what Claire's talking about is the other NEPA projects that you're going to be and like gate and things like that do have some non-commercial limitations in Stacy's the rest of Stacy's presentation. But grasshopper was a social limitation at the time, but it's no longer, so we will re-enter soon.
Thanks, Whitney.
Did I have that right, that it was, the prescription was cutting 12 inches and under, or was it 8 inches?
So typically we do a variety. So like in the pure oak, a lot of times we'll go to 12, just because the economic value isn't there. So we might as well just pile it. As we start getting into marginal units where some of the there's a little bit more economical value in the trees, we might go down to 8 inches. I'd have to look. I don't remember what the hopper thinning was, but I'll find out here before the end.
Okay.
Whitney, in your treatment designs, do you guys leave skips at all? What's the protocol for how homogeneous are the treatments by design?
So typically how we do non-commercial work is we do have leave islands, depending on the resource values of concern. A lot of that is around either sensitive species or endangered species. We have areas that we don't treat because of slope limitations, things like that. Would they look like traditional skips that are in commercial timber sales? No, because a lot of times what we could do is we'll thin through them, but we won't masticate through them. So we introduce a lot of different variability just purely with what the ground lets us do. And it's not going to be like a consistent, oh, we leave 10% here or 5%. We vary it by unit. And then with the spacing, we also allow for variability in spacing. So typically we give them 1 to 2 foot spacing variability, which can lead to anywhere from 10 to 15 trees per acre difference from the desired. And that's how we also allow for, especially in the ponderosa pine, that natural clumping that we like to see. We give them that spacing variance. So we'll let them leave a little bit denser ponderosa pine clump and then thin around it. So typically that's how we get our variability. Not necessarily just through traditional skips and gaps, but through a variety of different tools.
Okay. One of the things that I think has been challenging about our monitoring design is just like capturing that variability. It's just really expensive to put a lot of plots on the ground. So we are regularly contemplating like how to vary our monitoring approach to try to do that, but still have like a standardized set of data. What's really nice about having this protocol is that every plot that's gone in 100, more than 100, 200 plots that weren't on this landscape 5 years ago that will be here for as long as we need them to be here, right? We can relocate those plot centers and then measure in 10 years or 20 years and not just have information about how this project is, what the project outcomes are, but like what's happening on the landscape of broader trends as those plots are going in across the region. So that's kind of exciting. And there's a number of questions that we designed the protocol to be able to answer that we're not even, like, we're not working with the data yet because we need more time. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at these, this is very new recent results that you've collected. Going through those bullets, I'm curious if you could just dumb it down a little bit for me. I'm just wondering if, like, you could go through each one and say that's on target for us. Like, for example, I'm assuming you don't want in the end to decrease native forbs. So like, is that an expectation for, at this timing? And then what's your goal towards the end, or an end target, I guess? Similarly for all those bullets, if you could kind of highlight.
Yeah, I guess probably combination between the Forest Service and me
Yeah,
to
yeah,
answer that, but yeah, like you said, with the first bullet, you know, we don't want an increase in bare ground, but it's, you know, just several months after treatment, so like I said, yeah, ideally we'd come back next year, 2 years later, and we wouldn't see a change in bare ground. We basically wouldn't see a change in anything. You definitely don't want to see like an increase in non-native braminoids, for example. Potentially, you know, you want to see a decrease in shrubs because they masticated the shrubs. They want to remove that fuel. Yeah, I think it depends on the management goal. Like for the next one, that's decrease in Oregon white oak trees, you know, some projects you are looking to thin,
Yeah.
like we do have
exactly.
another
That's kind of why
project,
I'm
yeah.
asking, because I'm like, well, that's probably what you want, right? Yeah, you want the vigor to go, you know, those that remain to be more vigorous, right? I mean,
Yeah, it depends on, yeah, what the competition and how close they were together before, at the site. For the Forest Service, you know, I don't think their goal was to decrease the Oregon white oak, or I thought the goal was to decrease the conifers. But I think it's just a lot of the DBH limitations. And yeah, I think having an increase in seedlings is a good thing. And it's pretty cool that can happen so quickly after treatment. And you'll see the same thing actually with the fire. I'm gonna talk about prescribed fire next, so.
Yeah, it's just like the metrics are just what they are, and then the questions you ask of the data are designed to get at your objective, whether you got closer or farther from what your intended outcome was.
right,
So it just depends, right?
right, and I guess just for understanding, like, what? I can't tell if this is good or bad, is what I'm getting
Right,
at, yeah, or
yeah.
helpful or not helpful, or
Well, and
how would
sometimes,
you change it in the future or not,
Yeah.
yeah. So-
sometimes it's really nuanced, right? Like Chase is trying to manage for wildlife that utilize browse in the understory, and so sometimes he wants to cause reinitiation of the crown, right? He wants to
Mhm.
disturb the shrub and oak layer so that there's fresh forage for wildlife. That would be a desirable outcome. If someone's trying to reduce the overall density of shrubs or oak stems and like reduce competition, and then you cause a whole bunch of resprout, it's not necessarily getting you closer to your goal, right? Or if you're trying to reduce fuels and you reorganize, like you cut a bunch of mature oak and then they resprout, now you've just reorganized the crown from up here to down here. Not necessarily for, you know, advancing the goal unless you kill the resprout.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess it's just nuance.
Yeah. Well, presumably this was designed with targets in mind, so I just, yeah, wondered if you had those. It'd be cool to see side by side, like, well, we'll see it, hopefully in
Yeah.
5 years, we'll see a
Yeah.
change in this and that.
That's the way I see it. And we're gonna be doing similar work through the next FIP awarded money with domestication, or it's a control unit, different design. If I saw this data, that's totally what I would expect.
Yeah,
You know, increase bare ground, the equipment's in there, it's disturbing that,
Totally.
decrease in forms. My concern would be, are those forms coming back?
Yeah.
And did they get taken over by annual grasses
Yeah.
because of that bare ground? So that's where I'd be going, okay, if we saw this in year 2, I'd start to have a lot more concerns, and
Mhm.
what did we do wrong, where can we improve? Do we need to do something else within that? But I think for me, like the DBH is kind of an issue. We'd have to maybe look at that if we're doing mastication, because the masticator's gonna come out there. And if they're knocking down an oak tree that's 8-inch diameter, it's just like grinding down forever. But if they're just knocking down little saplings, it just knocks them out. So they
Sure.
focus on that smaller diameter stuff, and that's what I want to know more of.
yeah,
And a lot of the areas that I'm focused on has a lot of small diameter oak trees and clumps, coronal clumps. And we want to increase the vigor and improve to a single stem if we can. We're
Sure,
still with the difference
exactly,
between
okay.
some of that. But I think, yeah, it's just like you say, it's what do you want to know?
Yeah.
And then it's just the monitoring plot, you know, that I'm looking at this right now going, how are we gonna adjust it? How are we gonna change? So
Sure.
we can do some additional surveys under the understory to look at those anti-grass control and what that looks like. But it is like, when, yeah, first year right after that, that's. I see that data form, I'm like, that's exactly what we want, I increase those forms. So
Yeah.
this year, okay, it's not there yet, but expectations of the next few years.
great, yeah.
And I'll say for the Forest Service, we generally don't try to really target both of these kind of prescriptions, but sometimes you have to get to a density level that's sustainable over time, right? So the
Mhm.
things we're concerned with are, you know, competition and drought and things dying, and then also fire.
Yeah.
Fuels reduction.
Yeah.
So, yeah, sometimes that needs to, you know, some of the smaller oaks.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit more to the one on, why the, seedlings are being more prevalent? And how you're using that? It seems like that's gonna vary year to year based on the acorn production prior year.
Yeah.
And so there's other complicating factors. How are you looking at that?
We have control plots, so there's plots that aren't treated, and so you can compare the response across the treated group and an
Okay.
untreated group.
Depending on the project.
Depending
This
on-
one doesn't have any control plots, but yeah.
Some of it was funding dependent, and if there was actually an area that was similar that was not gonna get treated, we didn't wanna not treat in favor of the monitoring control groups. That's a good point. That
Can
background
I,
variability is super complicating. Sorry, online folks, you might have.
It's
questions.
Mary. I can't
Yep.
keep my mouth shut. Sorry, guys. Because this was so near and dear to my heart for a while there. I want to give kudos to you guys for processing some of this data because it took us a long time to get our procedures and everything in line and figure out how to monitor, to answer such a broad range of questions. And monitoring these really important parameters just 1 year after a project has all kinds of reasons why it is, it helps understand whether the people that are doing the work actually did the work in the way you might have asked them to do it. But other than that, it's going to take a few years to answer. But mainly, I just want to say kudos for getting the analysis started because it helps us know what better questions to ask or how to ask them. And I appreciate that you guys did that. It's great to see it. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And do we have time to begin writing any of this up? Are you still?
Well, what we plan to do is, I compile this into a report that we give to the Forest Service, and then we have to OWEB, we have to submit like a final grant report, like this is what we did. And so we attach those individual project reports, which are publicly available.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of our goals for this year is we've been thinking about how to complete that adaptive management feedback loop where you're doing all this work and you want people to make use of it, right? So we're compiling for every project that ECOP is helping to fund. We're compiling monitoring observations like those reports. And then when we do tours with project partners and we talk about what we're seeing, whether it's like before, after, or, a long time after the restoration or the disturbance, sometimes for wildfires. We're compiling those observations too. And then we're going to attach them to the projects on our website. So people can go look for similar treatment and the prescription will be there too. And just see like what happened. So that's something we're hoping to develop this year for the projects that we've completed monitoring on, or that we've done project tours to. And we'll work with the underlying landowner to make sure that everything we're presenting is fair and accurate and as good as it can be for public consumption.
Okay, I'm gonna move us on. So we have only 20 minutes to cover 2 more projects. So I'll try and go quickly through this. This is a prescribed fire that happened in May of 2025 on the Mount Hood National Forest. The research objectives of the burn were to restore stand health to improve resiliency to insects and disease, enhance and restore pine oak habitat and riparian reserves, and provide opportunities to safely engage in active fire near private land. ECOP again provided monitoring support by installing 15 plots pre-treatment and conducting a post-burn severity survey. And then follow-up post-treatment base plots were completed about 6 weeks after the fire. More specific prescribed fire objectives, kind of what Sarah was talking about from these are actually from the Mount Hood National Forest, were to reduce surface fuels by 25 to 75%. Reduce 1,000 hour fuels, so that's the coarse woody debris, by 25% or more, and limit mortality of trees 10 to 20 inch DBH to 10% or less across the unit. So we can use the data from our mine plots to help determine if these objectives were met. This is the plan from the Forest Service. They kind of outline 3 priority areas for prescribed burning. And we're focusing on that priority one. That's where we installed our plots, the irrigation unit. This is south of or near the Rock Creek Reservoir, if you're familiar with that area. So that's, yeah, our 15 plots were installed in that one unit. That red line is showing where the prescribed fire happened. It happened to the east or to the right of that line, and then to the left of the line did not burn yet. So plots 1, 6, and 7 were not burned, and I left those out of analyses. Okay, so starting again with the ground cover groups, not surprisingly, we saw an increase in ash of about 25%. Also, a slight increase in native graminoids. We observed a decrease in fine woody debris, non-native graminoids, and lichens. Some of the differences in the graminoids may be explained by the fact that grass ID by the contractor improved from year 1 to year 2. So some of the differences in the graminoids may be due to that fact and not necessarily treatment effects. Might expect a larger decrease in fine woody debris, 2%, oh, that's not that much. But there wasn't a lot to begin with. It only averaged about 7% pre-treatment and then averaged 4% post-fire. So that's actually an overall about 30% reduction in fine woody debris. So that does meet one of the prescribed fire objectives outlined by the Forest Service. Again, it's important to note these results are just 4 to 6 weeks after the prescribed fire. So again, these might not be as meaningful at this point. And I will just mention, yeah, a lot of this is kind of due to like funding, we have to get the plots in before this funding expires. So ideally, yeah, we come back next year, but we had to use up the funding by the end of this year. So this figure gives you an idea of the tree community at Rocky. It's a decent mix of Oregon white oak and ponderosa pine with a few stray Douglas fir. Sometimes land managers can conduct prescribed fire with the goal of thermal thinning, meaning using fire to reduce tree density. With this fire, we found no difference in density of any tree species with treatment. We were unable to actually analyze Douglas fir density because there was actually only 1 tree in 1 plot total, so pretty rare. Oregon white oak and ponderosa pine averaged 2 trees per plot. So it's a fairly open oak pine woodland. And with a low intensity burn, we might not expect to see a difference in tree composition or density. So I'd say these results make sense.
And that was not one of their objectives.
Right, it was more about just reducing the surface fuels. We did see a moderately significant effect of treatment on total number of snags. The majority of snags were ponderosa pine. There were a few Oregon white oak snags. Most of those were small, less than 5-inch DBH. Those snags averaged 1.8 per 50-foot radius plot before the treatment, and then 6 snags per plot post-treatment. And you might be thinking that an increase in snags, but no change in live trees is a bit contradictory, but this is simply because we have a variable plot size for measuring live trees. We measure the snags in the full 50-foot plot, but then the live trees are measured in varying size plots depending on their DBH. So most of these trees were medium, so they were measured in a smaller 24-foot radius plot. So we didn't, capture any change in that. One of the prescribed fire objectives was to limit the mortality of trees 10 to 20-inch DBH to 10% or less. And ECOP's also interested in if the treatments are retaining large oaks, including oak snags, since these are a valuable habitat resource. We don't really want to see those be removed. This figure here is a sum of all size classes of all species of snags, so it makes the objective a bit harder to assess, but I did go in and look at the data. And for oaks, there was only 1 larger oak snag that had a DBH of 8 inches, so still not that big. That was still there after the fire. All the other larger snags were ponderosa pine, and from scanning the data, the snags that were removed, presumably fell down after the fire, were usually 8-inch DBH or less. So I would say the prescribed fire objective was met for this variable. Those larger snags were left intact. We found significantly greater seedling counts post-fire in 2025 compared to 2024. The tree seedlings averaged 16 per 6.8-foot radius plot for treatment, and then 24 per plot in 2025. Majority of the seedlings, again, were Oregon white oak with just a few ponderosa pine. There was a moderately significant increase in oak stump sprouts after prescribed fire. The oak stump sprouts averaged about 9 per 24-foot radius plot before the treatment, and then 22 after the treatment. And this is kind of what the oak stump sprout looks like. So they were about, I'd say, 2 to 3 feet tall before the fire. Fire kind of killed the tops of them, and then you can see at the bottom they already resprouted with that nice fresh green regrowth. There was a decent amount of shrubby oaks to begin with, so the prescribed fire simply reorganized those sprouts back down to the ground, providing fresh browse for wildlife. Repeat fire might be used as a strategy to keep those stump sprouts in a lower growing position, but it also means those small stump sprouts might not have a chance of developing into a larger oak tree, raising past breast height and eventually producing acorns. Unlike grasshopper, there was no significant effect of treatment on crown position, which kind of makes sense. You can see kind of a tiny shift for more open grown oaks in 2025, where we had 3 trees classified as open grown and none before the treatment. There was a significant decrease in fuel bed depth after the prescribed fire. So fuel bed depth is the height of litter plus any fine woody debris or coarse woody debris on top. And the fuel bed depth averaged 2.4 inches before the treatment and 1 inch after the treatment, which seems like a fairly small decrease. It was a low intensity burn, but this is a significant result. 1 inch of litter represents tons of acres of fuel. So by reducing that fuel bed depth by over 1 inch, it decreases the future probability of ignition. And if a wildfire does ignite in the future, it should reduce smoke levels and reduce burning or residence time around trees. We have other measurements in our fuels transects, include the actual number of pieces of fine woody debris along the transect, number of coarse woody debris, coarse woody debris diameter, coarse woody debris log decay class. We found no significant differences in number of pieces of fine woody debris, but perhaps those weren't entirely consumed with a low intensity burn. We did see a slight decrease in average coarse woody debris diameter of about 1 inch. And that kind of makes sense that if you have a log laying on the forest floor and a fire comes through, it kind of burns through that outer layer and shrinks the log down. So the prescribed fire objectives, just to remind you, they were to reduce surface fuels by 25 to 75% and reduce the 1,000 hour fuels by 25% or more. At least within our mine plots, this objective was not met for the surface fuels, since we saw no reduction in number of fine woody debris, but we did see a reduction in fuel bed depth, suggesting at least the litter layer was reduced. We also did not see a decrease in the 1,000 hour fuels, that's the coarse woody debris or trees lying on the ground. But we'll go through some before and after photos now, so you can see how there was some consumption of coarse woody debris, but also new additions of coarse woody debris after the fire. So it's kind of a wash. So yeah, like I just said, some of the coarse woody debris was consumed, but then there was recruitment of others, like in this picture on the left is before the fire and right is after the fire. So you can see that there's some new trees lying down on the ground. But overall, the trend is that material is being reorganized and consumed. And with repeat treatment, the coarse woody debris in this area would continue to diminish. And that kind of is the Forest Service plan, to have these units being frequently burned. So with these photos, you can see some scorching of pine trees in the background, and then very little or no char around the base of that oak in the foreground. This is the final photo, just showing the shrubby oak layer that already existed pre-fire on the left, and then post-fire on the right with the fresh green resprout. And then just really briefly, I'll explain I'm kind of 2 weeks after the fire, you can do this burn severity module, and these are the results from that. Just put down a frame along the transects and classify the burn severity. So on the left is kind of an example of what heavily burned looks like. That's actually after a wildfire. And then scorched is on the right, which is from, that picture is actually from this rocky fire. So you can see that the majority of the transects were actually unburned or scorched or lightly burned. So it's definitely a very light intensity. And then, substrate is just kind of like the litter and the fine woody debris. And then this is vegetation, which would be actual, like grass or shrubs or whatever was standing there. And kind of similar, we see a lot of unburned and scorched and lightly burned. So overall, the prescribed fire was patchy, creating a mosaic of burned and unburned areas, which is typical of prescribed fire in our region, particularly for spring burns. We didn't see a meaningful change in coarse woody debris since some were consumed by the fire, but there were also new, fresh, fallen snags that we see in the photos. With repeat prescribed fire, that coarse woody debris would eventually decrease. And yeah, I already said for both of these projects, we have monitoring funding to revisit these plots in 2028 or whatever we think is appropriate, approximately 3 years after treatment, to reveal what treatment effects persisted, and also if there's any follow-up treatment that may be needed for these sites. Maybe interest of time, I'm gonna just keep going quickly, so because I don't know when Lucy has to get off, so I want to make sure Lucy gets to talk. I'm just going to introduce this project and then turn it over to Lucy, who's online here. We started an OEB funded mining project in 2024, focusing on the easternmost extent of Oregon White Oak Range. And the trailing edge forests were defined by Garrett Meigs and et al. In 2022 as locations between the current limits and projected future limits where some trees are unlikely to persist due to moisture stress. So this project is focused on the trailing edge for Oregon White Oak, where we see pine trees dying and Oregon White Oak actively pruning their canopies due to drought stress. It might take years or even decades for an oak tree to show significant signs of growth or decline. So it can be challenging to monitor their response to treatment to know, was this treatment successful or not? So we designed this monitoring project to give us more immediate insight into how over 200 oak trees are responding to thinning treatments. And we're collaborating with partners from Cal Poly Humboldt, Oregon State University, and NRCS to learn more about the trailing edge oak forests. Specifically, our objectives are to understand how oaks respond physiologically, as indicated by stomatal conductance and water status, to thinning of trees at their trailing edge of their distribution. And 2, understand if and how overstory tree competition for soil water varies as a function of stand density, tree species composition, soil characteristics, and stand level climate before and after thinning. The project focuses on restoration sites at the lower end of the precipitation range. So these sites have about estimated 18 inches of mean annual precip. We have 3 sites. That northernmost blue one is called Compadre, is owned by Lupin LLC and managed by AFM. It's about 30 minutes west of Dufur. The middle green site is on the Mount Hood National Forest and is called the Gate Project Area, which is south of the Rock Creek Reservoir. It's kind of just south of that rocky burn I was just talking about. And then the southernmost one is kind of hard to see. It's a little tiny yellow polygon there. That's on the Orange Springs Reservation in an area called Log Springs. This slide just shows what each site looks like, starting with Compadre in the top left image. It's an oak pine woodland at about 2,700 feet. There are definitely evident signs of drought stress in this area with dying pines and oaks that are pruning their leaves. The treatment here was a mechanical thinning, removing both pine, which is mostly dead, and oaks, aiming for larger spacing between the legacy oaks, which are the larger oak trees, and the slash is being piled and burned this winter. We get a lot of questions from ECOP members wondering if they should thin in their oak stands. So hopefully this site in particular will shed light on that question. And then on the right is the gate project area in the Mount Hood National Forest. It's at about 2,500 feet in an oak, pine, Douglas fir forest. So it's more mixed conifer, definitely denser. Treatment here was a sub 8-inch thin with mechanical mastication piling, and the plan is to burn those piles later this year or next. And then the log spring site on the reservation is an oak, pine, juniper site. The treatment here was just hand cutting ponderosa pine and juniper. Some of the slash was piled for firewood and others were left on the ground as is. So unfortunately, don't have time to go into all the methods. It's a pretty in-depth monitoring project, but the basics are that we have 3 treatment plots and 3 control plots at each site. And within each plot, we're taking multiple measurements on 12 sample oak trees. The physiological measurements on the oaks include measuring stomatal conductance, which will give more immediate insight into how the treatment impacted tree productivity. And then we're also measuring how hard it is to push water through the tree's xylem as a proxy for how stressed the tree is for water. And I'm going to turn it over to Lucy, if you're hopefully on there, Lucy.
Hi, yeah, I'm here.
I'm gonna drag you over here so people can see you. And yeah, if you want to share some of our baseline observations, let me know.
Well, thanks for inviting me to be part of this today. And yeah, so some of the findings that we've got thus far to share with you, we calculated or measured in the field the basal area for our different plots, so how much stem area of trees are there. And we had a bunch of graphs that we have, but we figured you've probably seen a lot of graphs today, so I'll just kind of verbally explain the highlights about that. So essentially the basal area was sort of the lowest at the Compadre site. So that one, you might, from the pictures, it was kind of just generally more open than the Gate site or the Log Springs site. And then measuring soil moisture, we measured soil moisture around all of our study trees. And from those measurements, soil moisture, and these data are from our 2024 pre-treatment summer. So in that summer, the soil moisture was, soil moisture was noticeably highest at the Warm Springs site, or the Log Springs site, which was kind of interesting. And it was really dry at Compadre, so with Gate sort of being in the middle. And then as far as kind of just going down these bullet lists here, the leaf area index, so that's a measure of how much leaf area is in the stand relative to ground area. So it's a unitless index, meters squared of leaf area per meter squared of ground area. So kind of like how big is the canopy. And so that was noticeably highest at Gate, with leaf area index LAI being pretty comparable between Compadre and Warm Springs, but noticeably higher at Gate. So kind of a lusher feel at Gate. And then as far as water stress, so we saw kind of going with what we found with the soil moisture, that Compadre had the lowest soil moisture measurements. It tracked then that when we measured water stress in the oaks at all 3 of these locations, water stress was noticeably highest at Compadre. So that was all kind of penciling and making sense. One other thing to note here, that there's not a bullet about it, but we also measured, as Stacy mentioned, the gas exchange or stomatal conductance as sort of a proxy for productivity in these trees. And that was highest at the Gate site. And this is kind of at the tree level. So not just because there's greater leaf area index at Gate, but kind of at the individual tree level, we were measuring greater productivity, again, before treatments at Gate relative to Warm Springs and Compadre. And Compadre had kind of the lowest gas exchange rates. Yeah, I think that's everything on that slide, and we can keep going. Great. And so here, we also, in addition to doing physiological measurements of gas exchange and water status, we also used stable isotopes in the water of our study trees. So we sampled little twigs, and then we could extract the water from these twigs and look at the isotopic signatures of those water samples. So one of the questions being, well, if you have like conifers and oaks coexisting, is that one, the conifers could be, yes, shading the shade intolerant oaks, but two, are they also competing for water with the oaks? Or perhaps the shade from that encroaching kind of conifer forest maybe buffers the oaks by shading them, buffers them from water stress. So we were curious about kind of how competition for water in the soil was playing out between conifers and oaks. And so by looking at these water signatures in the oaks and the neighboring conifers, we could try to tease out that answer. And so again, from 2024, before the treatments, we found that at Gate, the signatures were really similar between the oaks and the conifers, but then at Compadre and Log Springs, their oaks were getting water from measurably deeper soil depths compared to the conifers. So that was interesting to see that at one site, there seemed to be greater competition between these two kind of dominant overstory plants, whereas at the North Compadre and South Log Spring sites, there was more of like a niche partitioning of this limiting resource in the soil. And then a little kind of teaser about, so we went back then and did 2025 measurements at like a parallel, bio blitz of doing all of these measurements in the field in 2025 after the thinning treatments were done. And we haven't worked up all of the data yet, but generally at Compadre, it was kind of neat, like in the field real time, it was very obvious the difference between the treated stands and the control stands. So the treated stands generally had lower water stress and greater gas exchange, which was cool because that's kind of what we would hope to see. Although as things unfold, one never knows. So at Compadre, that was a pretty clear pattern. And then at the Gate site, these treatments happened later in the year and were pretty light initially. And so I think they went back and like did a little bit more thinning again, but there wasn't really a noticeable treatment effect physiologically in terms of water stress or gas exchange between the control and treatment stands this summer at Gate. And then at Warm Springs, it was more of a mixed bag. Like some of the pairs of the treated versus control showed, improved status for the oaks in response to treatment. And then some of the pairs of these plots showed that there was greater water stress and lower gas exchange in response to the treatment. And so that could just be a little bit of shock at this site following the thinning treatments. It'll be interesting to see how things shake out in post-treatment year 2 in summer 2026.
Thanks, Lucy.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, that's kind of all we had for that. I don't know if anybody has any questions for Lucy or about Rocky.
This is like a midpoint for the data analysis on this project because it's just year 1. And by design, we're going to do a heavier lift on the analysis in year 2 because that's when we have more data to work with. So this is kind of like an interim check-in.
It's like a question, maybe scaling this way back to like for how this would influence what your guidance to landowners would be. How would this start to change that? If I say, okay, I've got 5 acres of oak, and you come out and consult to improve the habitat.
Mm-hmm.
Is this information feeding into that, or at what point does this influence that lower level guidance? It sounds like this is definitely will influence the larger organizations doing this of how they do their next actions and things like that, but I'm trying to get an idea of like, if you will, when this trickles down.
Yeah. I think what this can do is provide a data point about a site on a
Yeah.
particular type of soil with particular growing conditions. So I think to the extent we can learn from it and it can inform what we understand about sites like this, I think that I would feel comfortable kind of letting it inform some of my management decision making. If my site's really different than this, I really wouldn't feel that comfortable. But it's all interesting. And one thing that we're doing in parallel to this monitoring project is working with an NRCS ecologist who actually is no longer with the NRCS. We're hiring him as a contractor to start writing what's called a state and transition model. And for each of the different ecological system types in East Cascade system. So we've classified them across 11 different types based on their soils and their elevation and their aspect and what types of vegetation communities are present. So we've kind of lumped those together in 11 different types of sites. And then we're going to write these models that try to anticipate using what we've observed on the landscape and what we observe in our monitoring, how they will respond to different types of disturbances. It's like if I thin my oaks, what can I expect? If I burn, what can I expect at different severities of fire? So that's a project that's gonna be happening over the next 2 years. And that has a key, so like you can go through the key and find the site that's the most similar to yours and then get guidance that's more specific to that type of system.
Okay, yeah, and that's helpful, and understandable changes, you're
Yeah.
saying environmental changes, but just trying to get an idea of
Where to start.
not necessarily wanting to be on the leading edge of experimenting on my property, but being like, hey, here's a common practice, follow the common practice.
Yeah, yep,
Yeah, thank you.
that's where we hope to get to,
Sounds great.
yeah.
Adam, go ahead.
Hey,
Adam?
thanks. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
Okay. Hey, a question for Lucy on the topic of resource partitioning as it pertains to oaks and conifers, where they exist in different soil profiles or their roots do to get water. I guess my question is, you know, if oaks have deeper roots than conifers, I'm assuming that's how it works. So they're not directly competing. At some level, if you have a bunch of conifers in a lower soil profile that are sucking up water, that's still going to impact and compete with water resources in the soil, at least in my brain. Do I have that right, or could you talk a little bit more about that resource partitioning and competition in the soil?
Yeah, it's a great question and good point. So yeah, if I mean, it's hard to know, without doing like destructive sampling exactly where their rooting depths are, but we can kind of infer from measuring the soil water isotopic signatures, which we have those data. We also collected those. We can kind of infer and see a map of how isotopic signature of water changes throughout the soil profile. And so using that, we can then infer based on what water we see in the trees, where they're getting the bulk of their water. So from the signatures that we can see, it looks like at 2 of the sites, the oaks are getting across the board kind of deeper water sources compared to the firs. But if the firs are more shallowly rooted, yes, maybe they are intercepting more water before it has a chance to infiltrate down to deeper soil depths. So there could definitely be some interactions there. Generally though, during like the wet rainy season, the soils are going to get super saturated with water. And so then during the dry summers, when there's no water input, that soil water that was kind of accumulated throughout the wet season, that's going to draw down across the dry growing season. And so those shallower soil depths are generally more exposed to evaporative losses, and the deeper soil depths are generally more buffered from that. And so I think once the winter water has kind of saturated the soil profile, then the act of the firs drawing on shallower water sources in the soil profile shouldn't have too big of negative impacts on the deeper soil water pools that the oaks might be tucked into. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, yeah, that's not how, yeah, that's helpful. So it's given all of that, it might not, yeah, might not be as impactful.
Adam, I was also gonna observe that we're taking these measurements at like the height of summer stress. So like, it's a fixed point in time where we can see that these trees are accessing different sources of water at the height of the summer drought. So I don't know if that helps in terms of understanding like um, the competition across time, right? But it tells us a picture at the worst moment in time for these trees, what they're doing. Does that help wrap your head around whether or not they're competing?
I think so. And it would still be interesting to kind of have a, I mean, maybe this isn't possible, but really just looking at like the soil water budget in general and what that looks like when you have a lot of conifers and oaks, and when you have a treatment where you remove most of the conifers and have the oaks, because I get that they're existing in different soil profiles, but um
Yeah, we do. We will eventually have those data. As Lindsay, I think it was Lindsay mentioned on, we did have an NRCS soil scientist, Andy. I think he's on the Zoom
yeah,
here.
he is.
Working on this. So we have soil pits at each of these sites. I believe it's one in a control and one in a treatment plot per site, where we're monitoring kind of soil moisture and many other things. But I don't have those data. I haven't seen those data yet. But so we will have that, which will be a really nice complement to these
Yeah,
the isotopics kind of analysis that
yeah.
we did. And then from other studies I've been involved with in oak woodlands, where we did monitor soil moisture across the growing season for a couple of years, it did seem like, that as I was kind of explaining based on the isotopes, what we see is that in the shallower soil layers, it's much more dramatic, like the drawdown across the growing season due to that exposure to evaporative demands. And then the deeper soil water, the deeper soils are kind of more buffered from that drawdown. It's more muted and not as dramatic.
All right. We are over our time. Can I just flip ahead? I'm gonna skip my slides here about the website, but I just want to make sure I say thank you to our supporters and funders for the monitoring work, including OWEB, the Oregon Department of Forestry, and the Wasco County Forest Collaborative. And I also wanted to highlight our contractors who helped collect a lot of the monitoring data I talked about today. So Skookum Resource Management and Mount Adams Resource Stewards. And then we also appreciate all of our Oaks and Trailing Edge mining collaborators and project managers at all of the sites. And thank you, Lucy, for joining us from California. And we're excited to share more about this project next year when we have our final year of data collection.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Lucy. Wasco SWCD too, help provide funding for monitoring.
Yeah.